We're so pleased to get into tonight's event. Grandmothering While Black with author LaShawnDa Pittman in conversation with Karen Henderson. Thanks so much.
So I'm going to share some of the amazing accomplishments of Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman, this endowed scholar sitting next to me, who has given us this book that puts Black grandmothers at the center of care and puts care at the center of our social fabric, which I think is a revolution. I'm a person who's been lucky to be real friends with you, LaShawnDa, and share a coffee shop table while you were writing portions of this epic and magnificent book. And so for those of you who don't know Dr. Pittman, I want you to understand that you're in the presence of a sociologist who does not separate care and thought. Care and thought are one and the same. Love and scholarship are one and the same, which is why this work is more than a book, though it is a book and you should buy it. It's an offering, a tool for community, and a framework for how real life gets lived in families and in society. I'm in awe of LaShawnDa Pittman, and that's before I even tell you about some of the things that she has done. Dr. Pittman is an associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. She's the Joff Hanover Honors Professor in Western Civilization. She has an appointment in the Department of Sociology. Several institutions have funded her work, including the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Northwestern University, Hiram College, and the University of Washington. She's the founder and director of the Black Digital Humanities Project, Real Black Grandmothers. In addition to this book, which we'll hear about tonight, Dr. Pittman's scholarship has been published in diverse venues, including Health Equity, the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences, Social Science and Medicine, City and Community, and Women, Gender, and Families of Color. Her research on grandparent caregiving and African American families has also been featured in the following edited volumes: Mothering and Black Lives Matter, Relational Poverty Politics, Healthcare for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Across the Lifespan, and the African American Experience Psychoanalytic Perspectives. Dr. Pittman is also a certified yoga and mindfulness meditation teacher and teaches mindfulness meditation classes to grandmothers, kinship caregivers, and others. In 2022, she'll be inducted into the Mind and Life Institute Fellow Program, where she will engage and collaborate with a global network of influential leaders committed to contemplative scholarship and practice. That's who's right there.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen Hartman. That's really great.
I wonder if you can just tell us about your journey to this book, how you became the person who could write this book, and how you did it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with one of my very best friends and the brilliant playwright, among other things, Karen Hartman. Thank you for your support, both tonight and just as you sort of already shared, like bearing witness to me working on this scholarship. When I was in graduate school, I was really committed to telling a story about Black women's resilience. And I feel like it was sort of the perfect storm of events that led to me choosing to empirically investigate grandmothers raising grandchildren. So there are several things. I'd gone from one graduate program to another, and my master's thesis looked at Black women and psychological well-being. And I presented that work at an American Sociological Association conference. And there was a group of Black women who were in the hallway, and they pulled me aside and were like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "This is what I'm doing." And they were like, "Let's go to her talk." And I had no idea who these women were. And it turns out they were like heavyweights in sociology. One of them, who's no longer with us, Lena Wright Myers, wrote this book, Do Black Women Cope Better? And they came to my talk and they were like, "This is really, really great. And we wonder how this would look for older Black women," because my study stopped at 62. Then I go to Northwestern for graduate school, and I did what are our comprehensive exams. It's called a special fields paper on the social capital of disadvantaged youth. Being a disadvantaged youth myself, growing up with a teenage mom on welfare, I was very interested in that topic. And grandparents were the primary safety net for children who are not in the care of their parents for various reasons. So there's the grandparent part that came up. There's these women planting the seed of looking at older women. And then I was in this dope methods course. I love methods. And there's this brilliant scholar, Art Stinchcomb, who was like, if you want to understand something that's hard to sort of hammer down, one of the best ways to do so is to look at extreme examples of it. And so I thought, what group of Black women are dealing with a lot and faring better than we would expect them to be? And that's how I came to looking at Black grandmothers raising grandchildren. And once I got into the field as an ethnographer, I love sitting down and hearing the stories of people. It's like there's no better way to understand how the kinds of like policies and things like that we create work for people than to find out from people. I got into the field and I started interviewing these women, and I knew I was going to spend my career focused on this group. It was just everything I needed in a research project. It was qualitative. It was heartfelt, so I could get at very individual level things. I could get at big structural things like poverty and ageism and neoliberalism and all these sort of things, social problems that I care deeply about, like poverty. They stole my heart. And I've got an entire research agenda now that focuses either on grandparent caregiving or Black grandmothers. And so I got so much more out of the deal than I ever thought that I would. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question that's kind of a huge question. So I know you'll take your time to answer this. And it has to do with what you hope the impact will be of the book. Because I know for you, it's more than a book, and the impact goes beyond the readership. So I would love for you to just share more about your goals for the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing that became really apparent to me in working on this book was just how much more complicated grandparent caregiving is than most people talk about. So I would say one of the big goals for the book for me was like sort of really like blowing up this idea that like Black grandmothers are raising grandchildren and they've always been doing that, so therefore we know what that is. And one thing I argue in this book, that even among these Black grandmothers who had family histories of grandmothers who were very involved in their upbringing, like my own. She didn't raise me, but like, you have to have an amazing grandmom to do this kind of work. I'm just saying. Just a shout out to Warnella Wells and Ida Wells, my grandmother and great grandmother. So, even in that lineage of like very involved grandmothering, and at times women who had been raised by their grandmothers for maybe a short time period of their lives, what they were experiencing was still fundamentally different than what they thought grandmotherhood would look like for them. They thought that their grandmothering would likely resemble what their mothers had experienced, or they had experienced with their mom's involvement with their children. And here they were having this really different experience, and largely because the issues that their grandchildren are facing in the 21st century look very different, right? The social problems that families are facing now is fundamentally different. I mean, if you just talk about the drug epidemic alone, you could end the conversation. But then you add to that the war on drugs and mass incarceration of Black and brown people. You add to that the racial geography of the criminal justice system in Black and brown communities. You add to that the racial geography of the child welfare system in Black communities. And you've got like different family circumstances. You have this not just actual fear, but actual fear that you're so afraid that your grandchildren will end up in the system. You know, and when you know the history of the child welfare system, you know that African Americans were either largely excluded from the system altogether or were provided separate and inferior services. And now we're overrepresented more than any other group in the child welfare system. So the threat of your grandchild ending up in the system is very real. And so even if they hadn't had direct experience with it themselves, it was just something that they were very painfully aware of. And so the child welfare system, the social problems their grandchildren and children faced. And then lastly, you all know we live in an incredibly bureaucratic environment now. It's very paper driven. So gone are the days when you could just take a child informally and enroll him or her in school or take him or her to get medical care. And so I argue in this book that there's now a lot more demand for grandmothers and grandparents having legal rights. So you have to go into a doctor's office and like, you have authority to get this kid treated. And so even when they themselves don't want to legalize this relationship, child rearing institutions are increasingly requiring that. So those are all differences that I think is important to highlight, that it is not business as usual for big mamas within families. It's a very much more complex set of circumstances. I think the other thing that I really wanted to highlight with this book, and it really made me kind of take a step back, which is what I love so much about qualitative methods, is I got to kind of step back and ask these women, what did you want for yourself in terms of grandmotherhood? What were your expectations for this role? How did you define it? And what was great about asking that question is that many of the grandmothers were not raising all of their grandchildren. So they knew what grandmotherhood looked like when they weren't raising kids. And so by kind of getting at that definition and those expectations, I got to then look at the role of coercion in care. And that's hence the 21st century story of love, coercion, and survival. So it's like, what happens when this role that you take on exceeds what you expect it to be, even when you expect it to be a lot, right? And so that's one thing I again, pushing back on this idea that this is Black grandmotherhood as it normally kind of is. No, this is something else. And how do we make sense of that something else? And there's this really dope scholar whose work I admire a great deal. She's an emeritus professor at UC Berkeley, Evelyn O'Connell Glenn. She writes a lot about care. And one of the things that she talks about is sort of why care is organized the way that it is. I mean, it's largely women throughout societies that do care work. But even deeper than that, when we think about children, when their parents are not caring for them, their grandparents primarily are. And so what contributes to that? Status obligation. So the majority of the folks who are stepping in are grandmothers. So when we look at coercion, it's got 4 elements. Who has the position that has them step into that role? We've decided as a society and as African Americans, society in general, but African Americans especially, that is grandmama. So status obligation, when the child welfare system is knocking at the door or is taking a kid at a hospital, who do they call first? Grandmama. Status obligation. The second one is that once you take on this responsibility, it's hard to get out. And it's hard to get out because the social structural realities facing these families are hard to overcome. They don't get overcome quickly. The third one is a loss of personhood. So then caregiving becomes so much of how we see these women, how they give up so much in order to do this work. And then the last one is that there are not any great options. So it's like, let your grandkid go into the system or what? You're going to step in and take responsibility. And so this idea of coerced care for me was like, yeah, that's something. And then I thought, for me with my work, there's some other stuff at work around grandparenting or grandmothering. And it's that grandparents have no inherent legal rights to children. 2 groups have those rights, parents and the state. So they are dealing with these 2 other forms of coercion when care comes up. Parents coercing that care and the state coercing that care. And so I created this concept called coerced mothering to get at that. So it's that grandmothers are being charged with performing the legal and social functions of motherhood without the legal rights, right? And so hence the idea of coerced mothering. So those are a few things. And then lastly, I'll say that I really wanted to really lay out the impact of becoming a primary caregiver to a second and third generation on women's economics, on their sort of hopes and dreams, the impact to their health, and all those sorts of things, their retirement, their relationships with their partners. And so I think, again, that we often think of grandmothers as just grandmothers. And so to actually think about them as women who actually are looking forward to an empty nest or are looking forward to spending time with their partner or those kinds of things. So those are things I hope to that come across with this book. I talk to policymakers. This book is very richly policy driven because I'm a policy girl. I think you've got to understand context, but I try to really do so in a way that uses real life stories to get at all these other things that I think are really important. Does that answer the question?
I think that answers the
Okay, good. Yay.
Are you going to read us a little bit? Because
Okay.
I think that's going to segue
Okay.
really nicely from what you just.
I would love to.
Think-
This is my first time reading from my book. I know, it's really, really weird. Wow. So I am doing some work with a group of kinship support groups in Seattle, Washington, and we're going to do a retreat next month that will bring in a little mindfulness and a little yoga, bringing in those other aspects of me that Karen mentioned, along with talking about this particular chapter of my book, because I feel like these women are really busy. Many do not have time to sit and read a 300-plus page book, and so I'm going to make a copy of this particular chapter, and it's called Managing the Burden and the Blessing. Let's see. So I'll start with a quote. This is, so when I really looked at like what did these women want for themselves beyond, what is not just what they want for grandmotherhood, but what do they want for themselves? You know, the theme that I saw across every interview was that they wanted freedom. And most people don't think about grandmothers as wanting freedom, right? And so this is called restricted freedom. So I start with this grandmother, Judy. She says, I just don't want to be tied down with little babies no more. I want to go to school. You know what I'm saying? I want to be a pharmacy technician, and I want to be free to do it. And after 7 kids, I'm ready. I'm tired. And so I say, so you're ready for a break? She says, I'm ready for a life. 51-year-old Judy was raising her youngest of 7 children when she was coerced into providing care for her heroin-addicted daughter Shantae's first child, 4-month-old Simone. Judy had been caring for others most of her life. Not only had she raised herself while growing up in the projects, but also she and her older brother had been charged with raising their 4 younger siblings. Although their mother didn't abandon them entirely, she was quote unquote out a lot. So their mother left them grocery money, and in her absence, they attended school only when they wanted. Judy married and had her first child at 16. She didn't reveal much about her children's fathers except that they had succumbed to tragic deaths and drug addiction. She'd been with her current husband for nearly a decade. All of Judy's children took care of their children, with the exception of her daughter, Shantae. But raising her granddaughter while she was still raising the last of her 7 children meant that Judy had experienced no break in child rearing since she began raising her younger siblings. So being, quote unquote, tied down with little babies not only prevented Judy from getting a break from child rearing, but it also thwarted her desire to have a, quote unquote, life, which for her meant going back to school. Her exasperated declaration, I want to be a pharmacy technician and I want to be free to do it, illustrated a common hunger. Freedom was not only the conduit to a life, however these women defined it, it was a prerequisite. They needed to be free in order to tend to their personal lives. Freedom seemed to be characterized by 2 primary traits: choice, having and using options, and movement, being able to come and go at will. Raising children required significant time, energy, and resources, which tethered women to the home front, restricting their ability to fulfill their own needs. Before assuming responsibility for their young grandchildren, women with their own adolescent children at home might still have factored them into their plans, but their day-to-day lives and schedules hadn't been dominated as they were about to be by resuming care for younger children. Many of these women talked about counting down to freedom based on the age of their youngest child. As Sylvia put it, girl, I got about 4 more years. And this is before her teenage children were grown and out of the house. I'm all geeked up. But parenting another generation changed all those calculations. Victoria says, well, my 14-year-old in 4 more years, she'll be gone. But since Nia, 6-month-old granddaughter, is here, I won't have the freedom. Eloise says, this is my time. My daughter just had made 18, and I was like jumping for joy. Free at last, free at last, free, free. And then 2 months later, I get the kids, her granddaughters. In the last season of their lives, older women and partners present during the interview expressed hope for enough time to do the things they wanted to do before they no longer had the time and energy to do so. Bertha says, I got 2 more years and I'll be heading for 80. But I still hope I have some more spunk and stuff to do something, to go somewhere. Eliza says, so I think just to enjoy some freedom, a different kind of freedom, not having to always take care of somebody else. We'll be taking care of each other because I'm taking care of him now. This is her husband. He has a lung condition and he had to take disability leave from his job. And then lastly, Virginia and Norman in unison say, when I asked them, so you all would have less responsibility? Yeah, no responsibilities. Responsibilities would be to each other, doing what we want to do. Basically, women wanted what one grandmother articulated as the freedom to go when I want to go and just do what I want to do. A stay against the dominance of Black women's social worlds. A reprieve from being mothers and grandmothers, wives, girlfriends, workers, daughters, activists, other mothers, and community workers. In fact, what they want to do and where they want to go didn't even need to be defined, figured out, or tied to a role or identity. Women didn't feel the need to accomplish anything in particular, just to be able to do whatever, whenever they were so moved. Being able to do and go took them myriad places. The skate rink, trips with and to see loved ones, visits with other seniors, their beds and couches to convalesce, the boat, meaning the casino, family reunions, hanging with friends, non-caregiving support groups, God, restaurants, and doctor's offices. It allowed for rest, recovery, discovery, adventure, reflection, healing, socializing, or the luxury of doing nothing at all.
Thank you.
I can't even believe I wrote that.
I can't believe you wrote that either. I read it. It sounds
right?
it sounds good, right? It sounds really good.
It's like weird to like read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions for you, and I don't know if other people might have questions for you too, but you coined this phrase in this book that has got so deep under my skin as a concept that it has shaped the way I think about my own life and the lives of other people. And that's the phrase anticipatory responsibility. And I would love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I also want to say Karen was like the first person to read my book entirely. Like the fastest, like it was so like, yay. So what I argue in the book is that when I really wanted to like make the case that these women were experiencing coerced mothering, I had to look at what were their expectations for grandmothering. What does Black grandmotherhood look like? It's always been distinct from white grandmothers. And so I came up with this idea of anticipatory responsibility, and it's this sense of duty to and obligation for one's grandchildren. So there's the expectation that because of racism, because of poverty, because of all these things, I'm going to be responsible for my grandchild. Like my grandmother was responsible for me, right? And my great grandmother was responsible for me. It is not synonymous with raising one's grandchild or children. And so women defined it differently, right? For some reason, some women, it was synonymous, but for many, it absolutely was not. And so most of them wanted to be grandmothering, not parenting or mothering their grandchildren. But there is this sense of like, because of sort of family lineages, social structures, I can anticipate a certain amount of responsibility towards the next generation. And so that's the idea. And I love that you've talked about how you can think about anticipatory responsibility towards a number of things in terms of roles.
Yeah, I feel like the phrase for me just stuck in this way. Like I anticipated caring for my own mother because my grandmother lived a very long life, and I watched my mother do it, and then my mother passed away younger. And so I feel like this sense, but it was like your phrase, anticipatory responsibility, helped me understand that without even knowing it, I'd been preparing for a role where I was then not needed. So it's different, but it's one of the many ways that I feel like your book has these ways of naming the way that care works inside us and also in society that is new.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. I'm so glad it resonated.
I have more questions for you, but also I don't know if anyone else wants to ask a question.
Sarah, you got that look.
Yeah, it's not formed into a question, but it just strikes me that it's so American, right? Like in other societies, intergenerational care wouldn't look like the same burden. I mean, yeah, I think about that a lot. Like this is just it's so American, and that system it's making my cheeks red, like so angry. But I guess it makes me think. Yeah, I love the concept of the village. Like, what would it look like for these women if they spoke about like what would support look like for me? I don't know if any of them spoke about that.
No, I love that. I love the idea too of thinking about this globally. I gave a talk this week, and one of the things that I talked about was some of the global trends around grandparent caregiving across the world. And, you know, I imagine that it's a mixed bag, right, of sort of anticipatory responsibility that is defined as my kid migrates away from some part of rural China and ends up in the city because that's where the work is, and I then take care of the child, and then the parent sends money home, whatever. And I would say importantly, that has been a big part of the Black story. Like that was us during the Great Migration. But I think to me what's so American is sort of the punitive nature of the criminal justice system and the child welfare system that's driving this in a very different kind of way. And the insidiousness of residential segregation, all those kinds of things. So I think about the social support networks that these women experience. So I'm going to say a couple things about it. One that I thought was really fascinating was that I would ask, well, let's talk about your social support. And I can't tell you, like I would say, like the majority of women were like, I don't have any social support. And I'm like, okay. This is what's great about doing qualitative work too. So you get people talking. Like, it turns out almost all of them did. And what I got about that is I really spent time with, not just my data. So one thing I will say about this book, these interviews, there's 74 interviews collected at a particular moment in time, but they're highly contextualized in what's happening now, right? So what was happening then, but also what's happening now, and also other people's work who also looks at these phenomena. What I got present to was that they felt like they didn't have social support because at the end of the day, the buck stopped with them. So people will help me, but nobody else is going to take responsibility for this child. And many of us know being primarily responsible for the child is very different than supporting somebody else who is. And so I think that was the knee-jerk response, that at the end of the day it was on them, because at the end of the day it was on them. But yeah, they wouldn't have made it without their social support networks. One of the things that I think is really different for like young moms in poverty versus grandmothers raising grandchildren in poverty is that their networks are more seasoned. These women are older. Many had siblings who were now grown that they could rely on. They relied on their own mothers if they were still alive. They relied on other children, for instance, that they had. Nieces, nephews. I saw sons who stayed home and wouldn't move out because they didn't want to leave their mom alone with kids without help. And so families supported in all kinds of ways, economically, childcare, housing, all those things. One of the things I was hoping that would come out of this chapter, Managing the Burden and the Blessing, is that one of the ways that families need to be thinking about support is also giving a break so that women can tend to themselves. So it's not just like childcare while I run to the store, which is still a function of me caregiving, but like, how about just give me a night out with my friends? How about give me some time away to go take care of my own health needs? And so I think that's a place where social support could be stronger. But yeah, that's some of what I saw around social support. I'm so glad you raised all of that. Josh.
Along the same line, right? I'm going to try to formulate some sort of question, but you said you're a policy person.
Yeah.
But on the same note, you also say like going into the system is like the biggest fear. Yeah. So and you said there's the state and the parent have rights, and the grandparent doesn't have rights.
Right.
So what kind of policy would you like? What kind of I haven't read it yet, but what kind of policy would you advocate for to address all those with the state? Because policy comes from the state, right?
Yeah. No, that's great. And so one of the things that I'll say that grandmothers have no inherent rights, but because of the need for legal rights, what we're seeing now is more and more grandparents seeking legal guardianship of the children in their care. So we're using legal guardianship in a way that is historically not meant to be used, right? So I think that's one thing. And I have this concept called quasi-legal rights, because when the grandkids are in the child welfare system, grandmothers have all kinds of various types of legal rights depending on the kind of care arrangement they have with these kids. So it's very complex system. In terms of some policy recommendations, there are so many. So some of them have to do with, I think there's a continuum of policy recommendations around the child welfare system. One is abolishing the system and giving those decision-making powers to communities, to families, and at the very least, providing more mediation type of services versus coming in heavy and punitive with families, like automatically removing parents instead of providing parents with support, unless the child is, of course, in danger. But we know that the majority of kids who are in the child welfare system, it's largely poverty-driven neglect versus abuse. And so providing those kinds of supports to parents so that less children end up with grandparents to begin with, and then providing more mediation support. Like, that's a model that has been shown to be really effective, but like the funding for it isn't there relative to the funding that we use for the larger child welfare system. I think those kinds of policies are great. I also think one of the things I talk a lot about is the lack of transparency for what kind of options are available to these caregivers. You know, many of them that I interview were not told what their options were once those children were placed in their care. And so some were like, maybe I want to become a kinship foster parent because then there are more resources available that way, but they aren't given that option. Or some are like pushed to do that when they really don't want to, right? And so I think those are the kinds of things I talk about. I also think economically, there are things that need to be done. So for instance, 67% of grandmother-headed households live in poverty. That's also America, you know? And what I find with these families is that they slip through the cracks of these sort of two policy worlds. You have social support networks for families, but most of those are not created for grand families. They're created for parent-child families, right? And so there's a whole set of challenges and obstacles that they face trying to get those supports. And then aging type of policies are not created for older people who are raising kids. And so, having, and I talked to policymakers about this, like having these families also be central to how they even come up with policies to support families and to support aged populations, I think is really important. So those are some. Yeah.
But I think
we're good.
we're good.
Yeah, we are.
I think
Thank
we're
you
just
so
getting
much.
started and we're at the end.
Yeah. I love
So,
that.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thanks for coming out, y'all.
Thank
It really does
you.
mean a lot.
And thanks
Yeah.
to a Word Up.
Thank you. Thank you, Word Up. Thank you, thank
Word
you,
Up,
thank
Word
you.
Up.
Word Up is
Yeah.
like, yes, all the
Yes.
things. Like, this reminds me of everything good in life in one place. But I'm biased.